And get to our special guest, Ward Duschamps from TELUS, and Damian, who attended together and did some deep work at this ITU. I guess, was it technically a plenary or a? I don't know the terminology.
It was a workshop, and I believe
Oh
it
no.
was a workshop convened by Study Group 17, I believe it's called. But so
Yep,
correct me
that's
if I'm wrong,
correct.
Ward.
No,
Yeah.
no, that's totally correct. It's a workshop study group organized by SC17.
Fantastic. Well, Ward, it's great to have you here. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. I thought maybe I'll just very quickly give some of my takes from the workshop just to set things up, and then it would be fantastic to hear from you, and both in terms of your impressions from the workshop, anything you found particularly interesting, but also it'd be great if you could just touch on the presentation you gave at the workshop and some of the kind of really interesting ideas behind that. So if that sounds all right, cool. I'll just sort of set the scene really. So yeah, as mentioned, both Ward and I attended this workshop. It was at the end of March in Geneva. It's a workshop of the International Telecommunications Union.
Wait, wait,
And
wait. Can you just pause a second?
of course,
One, can you stop the recording and then restart it so that we have these as two separate recordings? One of the working group and then one of the hot takes? No, he can't. Okay, we'll have to cut it later. Great. Keep going.
We'll just cut it later anyways. All right.
cool. Yeah, so the workshop was 2 days. First day was on human identity frameworks, and the second day was on agentic identity. So obviously we're going to focus on the content from day two. I'll just give some really quick kind of impressions from me. So in terms of kind of the challenges and gaps that were discussed around agentic identity, some of the ones that I noted down. So there was someone said existing frameworks can handle existing AI. Obviously, that's for debate. Another person sort of mentioned that starting from scratch in terms of developing new protocols is hard, but then the kind of counter argument to that seemed to get a lot of support was that autonomy with agents really changes everything. And specifically, one of the comments was that it's very hard to apply a traditional OAuth flow in an agentic world. Then some of the kind of more specific gaps that were mentioned. So around agent identity and trust, there was, for example, workload identity is definitely part of the mix here, but there were some remarks that workloads are composites and therefore going with a single URI won't necessarily work. Another point is that SPIFFE wasn't designed for cross auth domain trust. There was also a presentation on the potential role of DNS, but then also acknowledgement that DNS doesn't work for ephemeral agents. In terms of authorization, a point that I noted was that OAuth 2 is session-based and coarse-grained, and agents could therefore be overall underprivileged. The example was given of like if you have an agent scanning resumes to look for a good candidate, then that could lead to browsing a salary database without authorization, for example. Another sort of interesting point from a legal perspective is that, the person who made this comment was heavily involved in drafting the GDPR regulation. So he said the legal implications of agents can be catastrophic, and that legal input is crucial to creating a framework that businesses are actually going to adopt, which I thought was an interesting point. And then just quickly in terms of some of the ideas that were shared to address these challenges and gaps. So the first thing that I would say, and Ward sort of, please comment if you disagree with any of this, but my impression was that there was quite a consensus that agentic identity needs to be layered. So it seems that there wasn't disagreement that there is a role for SPIFFE and workload identity. There is a role for OAuth. There's a role for decentralized identifiers and verifiable credentials. There's a role for API gateways and for DNS, potentially. So it feels as though whatever the solution is needs to incorporate some of these different layers. there was, and actually this next comment goes straight to the conversation that Tom and Alan were just having, but a move from session-based to task-based authorization, for example, binding to a CEDA policy was one idea shared. Another one, doing authorization based on the agent's behavior and not the resource they're asking for, or not solely the resource they're asking for. Going through a policy engine to get a new identifier. That was also an interesting one, which apparently is important for monitoring and incident response. And then back to the legal point. So the same gentleman said that the law was never designed to interpret ephemerality. So when you have ephemeral agents, that immediately causes potentially a real problem, which would obviously require any agent to be able to trace back to someone with kind of human or organizational authority. And he mentioned this idea of code as law. So moving governance into the protocol layer, which he said is the only feasible approach. Basically, it's not sufficient on its own, but you have to do it, was his view. And then the last idea, and one that I found one of the most interesting of all, is actually from Ward. So human intent is the new trust anchor, which is probably quite a good jumping off point, Ward, to bring you in.
Damian, it's funny to see that all the points that you mentioned actually resonate very well with my observations of the most important things that have been said. So
okay, good. Excellent.
That's very good. So I've got a number of slides that I can use to basically give a little bit of a structure to the story. Let me make sure that I can share my screen. Does this work?
Yep.
Very good, very good. So maybe 2 words on myself first. So my name is Duschamps. I'm based in Belgium. I currently work for Thales since 3 years. I'm in the product strategy group, working on the intersection of AI and cybersecurity. And next to that, I'm a member of a number of different think tanks within Thales. And actually, a number of things that we presented on ITU is the outcome of think tank. It's not yet productized. An important side note. And indeed, so it was an ITU workshop. My 3 takeaways, and that is very much aligned with what Damian actually already introduced. My top 3, right, is we need layers, we need lawyers, and we need longevity. Sorry. The layers is really a way to start to make agent identity workable and interoperable, so that we can kind of differentiate different layers in an overarching architecture and work in parallel on different items. Very much like what we did with user layer years ago for networking. We definitely need more lawyers because agents act like a subject, but they do not have legal capacity. So there is a huge question mark and code to law, law to code, and legal engineering, all these things become very important. It was actually fun to see that a lawyer came up with the word digital power of attorney, and you will see that word in a second as well. And indeed, that's the guy that helped writing the GDPR. And another important or an interesting or a fun fact is that someone said we need to be prepared to expect 900 billion of agents by 2030. So that the scale is tremendous, and existing frameworks have never been tested on that scale level. And so that scale will be a big challenge moving forward. And that indeed very, very well resonates, Damian, with points that you brought up, right, as the hot topics of the conference. So let me quickly zoom in on one of these things, and that is a new potential trust model that we proposed for AI agents, and that is indeed based on the works that we've been doing internally. What we believe is that our perspective is that what we see today in the agentic world is far from what we need to build for, what we need to design for. Because the agents that we see left, right appear in the enterprise, that's only kind of agentic. I would call it agentish, right? But far from what we need to expect. And so we need, if we come up with new models, we need to design for a true high level of autonomy, not just AI for assistance. And so trying to get the human out of the loop and replace the human with something else. And that would be then an intent-based or intent-driven execution. The elephant in the room, right? Is OAuth good enough to deal with AI agents? Yes, no, right? That was one of the key questions that we wanted to address. And to address this question, we start by giving a very simplified representation of OAuth. And that shouldn't be a surprise to anyone on the call, I guess. But it's a very linearized model. The user gives a consent to an authorization service. And it's based on that consent that the authorization service can now authorize a client so that the client can get access to a resource. And that is for us like the very simplified linearized version of OAuth. And so at the end, we would call it, this is a delegated authorization from user to client. And that works perfectly fine for the use cases that we've seen so far with mobile apps and web apps and set-top boxes for television and what have you. All works fine. But the question is, would that also work if we just replace the client with an agent? And would that delegated authorization model then actually still hold? So let's try it. So in this diagram, we just replaced the client with an agent, but an agent never comes alone. An agent comes with multiple agents, multiple agent systems, MAS. And so the question is, would this work? And we've got three fundamental gaps that we think that makes that actually breaks this model. The first gap is that there's a time mismatch. OAuth is built on short-lived tokens, built on the concept of a session between a user and authorization service. But in the agentic world, there's a big time mismatch between the time that the user actually gave an instruction to an agent and the time that the agent will take the effort to execute on that instruction. And that is maybe different than what we are used to today with all the chatbots that we have. But in true autonomy, right, there may be hours, days that the agent can act independent of any user interaction. So there's a time mismatch compared to the original design paradigm of OAuth. The second mismatch is at the left side, is that the intent of the user is not resource aware. So again, back to the OAuth design principles. In OAuth, people assumed, maybe implicitly, but that the user actually had an understanding and an appreciation of the resources that he or she wanted to consume. And so the user was aware of what happened at the right. But in the agentic world, that's just no longer the case. That assumption fails because the user now defines what's need to be done, but through autonomy, the agent has now the power to decide on how things get done. So the user is no longer aware of the resources that needs to be consumed. And then the third fundamental gap is actually the same, but from a perspective of the agent at the right side of the diagram. And that is that agents actually do not know upfront which resources that they need to consume. So there is no longer a list of fixed scopes. There is no longer a defined set of known resources. The agent in its execution, with a high level of autonomy, will decide its own path of execution and may use resources that may have been defined upfront, may not have been defined upfront. And that makes for us to conclude that what currently exists in OAuth is just not easy rip and replace a client with an agent. So we need something more. So what if we now actually go back to the linear model and change the location of two different things? What if we move the agents to the left and we move the authorization server to the right? Would that work? We think it may. And because then we've got a user that delegates an intent to an agent. And we will explain a little bit more how that we see that. And it's based on that intention that the agent now can determine what the execution path would be. And then it's up to the agents to make sure that they can preserve that original intent when an instruction goes from one agent to another agent to another agent. And whenever needed, an agent will require a decision from an authorization server to access a particular resource. And then at that given point in time, the intent of the human will be used in an evaluation, policy-based, to determine whether this agent now legitimately can access a particular resource. And so far in our thinking, in our proof of concepts, this seems to work. This seems to also give a very natural flow in the end user experience. I will show you that in a second. So far, we didn't find any obstructions yet, but still very early days. What we started to document in a white paper is how that we actually see such a protocol at a very high level. I'm not going into the technical details of each and every bit in the protocol, but first concepts, right? And then we can go into the details afterwards. So we see a process in 4 different steps. And each and every step in that process may live in its own time frame, right? Meaning that there can be quite some delay between the different steps. And so step number 1 is when the user gives that intent to an agent, we call that power of attorney, because that was for us the terminology that felt the most logic to use for now, because it is like a true power of attorney that we are used to between people, but then between a user and machine. Then in step 2, that power of attorney needs to be held in a secure way by the agent and passed from one agent to the other agent, which is what we call the propagation phase. We may need some vault mechanism. We may need some crypto technology, because that power of attorney becomes a very important artifact. We also may need some kind of central or decentral ledger to verify the legitimacy of that power of attorney as well. Because in the step 3, that one of the agents now presents that artifact to an access control layer. And there will be in step 4 then an evaluation phase where some element, the access control layer, will verify the original intent, context of the agent, context of the request, and grant or deny access to data. We tried to put that also in some kind of a prototype from a user point of view, right? So how would this actually work? And this now already has been built and supported by technology. I can't show it yet today, but you can imagine that the teams are working hard on this. So this is a prototype where we go into the persona of a chief operations officer at the company L'Oréal, just for sake of example. And it is the agent or the chatbot that at a given point in time suggests to take more autonomy. And that's actually also what we expect in the real world that will happen as well. And then agent and human starts to negotiate about the power of attorney. And for instance, what is the frequency of updates?
I'm listening to something. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Thank you.
Frequency of update, tolerance of stock, sales pipeline, a number of parameters could be part of that negotiation. There may be a change. And at the end, all these mini decisions are documented in a formal format, which becomes the power of attorney. Then the chatbot presents a challenge response. And we now suggest to use an out-of-band mechanism like smartphone to scan a QR code, use FIDO and what have you for biometric checking, and remotely sign that security artifact. Now the agent is equipped with a signed power of attorney, and now that agent can actually continue its journey with that security artifact. So we started documenting that this in these different 4 phases, I think that I mentioned that. We also put some thinking in a number of complex use cases. So what if the power of attorney is something that can be defined up front, maybe? But what if it has not been defined up front, but one of the resource servers actually expects such a power of attorney? So how do we handle this back and forth of request response between end user and the resource? And with that, I think that I can kind of conclude. So we think, and together with me, a number of colleagues, and also actually supported by some voices at ITU. So it is the level of autonomy that will change everything. And that feels like under-evaluated, underappreciated so far. And so why is that? That is because user defines what, the agent defines how, right? That's a new paradigm. We have to get used to it. There is a huge time delay between intent and execution, which is, again, one of the things that is very, very often ignored. And we have to admit that agents can define their own access paths. Not yet the reality of today in the enterprise, but that's what we expect moving forward. And then the only thing that we actually can rely on from in such a complex ecosystem is, in our perspective, human intent. And with that, I'm opening the floor for questions and having a little having some minutes to discuss as well. Subra, I see your hand raised.
Hi, thanks, Ward. That was good. The question that I had was the specificity of the human intent. So intent in the context of interactions with LLMs, etc., can be quite vague. And I'm wondering if you had any thoughts about how that is captured in the context of this power of attorney notion that you have, because the vagueness has to be more, it has to be pinned down to some extent in order to do what you're talking about, right?
Yep, totally agree. And that is a challenge. How that we currently address this is that we actually trained an agent to go in a negotiation about the power of attorney. And so that agent is equipped with a number of templates that make sense in that particular context. And it's based on that template, on these templates, that the agent will start questioning the end user on the level of autonomy that the user actually wants to grant to the agentic system. And so we see that capturing that initial intent, we see that as a two-step approach. There will always be some kind of natural language processing, but next to that, we also try to convert natural language in structured data, because structured data is easy to interpret by policy, and we will gain on latency. We will gain in simplicity in intent verification at the end. So we see that as a two-sided track, natural language for sure, but when we can also structure data. Make sense?
Yeah, let's start.
Is there like just piggybacking off of that, is there some sort of confirmation step where the human whose intent has been translated into structured data is like that would be my first thought.
And that is correct, and that is what we plan to do with. Basically, we want to reuse the user experience of multi-factor authentication, right? People get used to use FIDO and things like that to authenticate. So what if we now can leverage that experience, that user experience, and we apply that to signing of a digital document? Very much like what we in Europe are very, very well used to if you want to sign a bank transaction above a certain value, right? Then we are also actually redirected to the mobile device to do a signing transaction outside of the bank environment to add more security. And so we expect a very similar user journey. Helen, maybe up to you.
How do you represent the capabilities? OAuth tokens are not suitable, so what formats do you use?
So for intent, also something still to be evaluated. So we are testing a number of different formats. We are testing verifiable credentials. And so a verifiable presentation then would be the thing that we hand over from agent to agent. But we are also experimenting with recent JWT formats because that is easy to compute. So
I would
go ahead.
recommend not using verifiable credentials because they're designed for claims, not permissions, and delegation and revocation mean completely different things. You might look at UCAN or ZCAP as better representations.
Yep. Thank you. Yeah, indeed. These are the considerations that we have to take into account.
And I would mention too that verifiable presentations in most tooling that's out there don't necessarily have to contain only verifiable credentials. So you can have one or more verifiable credentials that are pertinent to the delegation chain, but have the actual permission delegation chain be modeled in some other format. Like ZCAPs are JSON LD. So if you're using like classic VCDM, ZCAPs are the same signing format. You sign it with the same key. You sign over. It's like they compose well. You don't need to limit a VP to only VCs. So Alan's advice to think beyond VCs for the permission isn't necessarily thinking beyond the VC like broader ecosystem economy of scale. It's more for the permission artifact itself, maybe.
Yeah. And so in our current thinking, the format is still to be defined. We first need to agree on kind of the principles, I guess, and then we have to find a good format actually to bring this into life.
And I have a document on use cases that expose the hazards in IAM systems that you might want to look at.
Okay.
I'll put a link.
Yes, please. Yeah, definitely interested.
If I could jump in with one note as well. It could be useful for the semantic base around the delegation side of the word intent to look into promise theory, where agents can only promise their own behavior. So this doesn't cover the deterministic side of AI that is more like systems based, but when it comes to intent, it's a bit more wishy-washy. So promises are actually more powerful for generating trust in intent ecosystems than impositions. So just check out promise theory, and that could also help inform that side of the language and the semantics of your work.
Yep, thank you. Yeah, that's a good tip. I see Matthew still raised his hand as well.
Yes. Just two things in the metaphor of power of attorney. Unless the person is mentally incompetent, then they can revoke power of attorney at any time. I think that it would make sense for that feature to be added to any sort of functionality, so revocation at any time. I also feel that, again, it's power of attorney. In real life, you can give power of attorney over medical and not financial, or financial not medical. But even in a medical space, for example, it's still private information. So you might actually want to implement some sort of zero knowledge kind of proof that allows you to only know which permissions have been given, even to the person who is checking the permissions.
Yep. And that was actually one of the arguments why people started looking at VVVP. Yeah. But there may be alternatives for that as well.
Just want to quickly check in, Ward, on your time, because I know that the session was sort of officially half an hour, so I want to be respectful of your time. Please, obviously, feel free to drop, or if you've got another 5 minutes, also that would be great. It's up to you.
I'm fine. I'm fine. I still have a
Okay.
couple of minutes. That's totally fine.
Thank you very
Yep.
much. Appreciate it.
So is there a need for agent-to-agent negotiation? You showed the negotiation between the person and the agent, but do you see a need for agent-to-agent negotiation?
At a given point in time, yeah, I think yes. So for now, this is a model based between user and agent. But if the reality is that we will have more agents than human beings, right? There may be a power of attorney between one like trusted agent and a less trusted agent.
I'm asking, I have some old work on automated negotiation that came up with a flexible framework that might be applicable.
Oh yeah.
So just you can contact me if there's interest.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. The thing is that there are a lot of things that we actually do not know yet on how to prepare for, right?
Just in our experience when doing like the logs for agents, my issue is what was the original intent of the human user and what is the intent of the current agent interacting with another agent? Because if it was humans, if I hired a lawyer and my lawyer performed recklessly while interacting with another lawyer, there would be liability attached to the second lawyer. So for me, the original intent and the agent's intent when interacting with another agent are important to separate.
Yeah, actually, that's good that you mention it, because what I talked about so far is the defined intent, defined by a human, like in a document. But then next to that, there's also an intent that is derived from activity, based on historical interactions of agents with other agents or agents with data. We can indeed derive the intent of an agent. And in our current thinking, we've got the defined intent and derived intent. What we could do in policy is actually check whether they match or not. Because it's based on these historical interactions that you can kind of build a picture whether this agent now behaves within the original defined intent. Any other questions, comments?
I do have a comment. I'm kind of shocked Nicola isn't asking a lot of questions here, because this theory shares a lot with his vision of user defines what, agent defines how, and anchoring everything in the original marching orders that trigger complex multi-agent cross-domain non-deterministic action. And some of the debates we've had on calls of the working group and on chair calls have been about how to effectively anchor, like how to hold every actor in the system across boundaries to hold them sort of liable against their interpretation of this fixed power of attorney or intent document or whatever you call the charter of a distributed transaction or the constitution. I don't know. I naturally go towards more political metaphors than legal metaphors, but a debate. I think Dimitri already dropped, but Dimitri pointed out once that if these agents are on different operating systems and different clouds and different runtimes. It's very hard, even if you have some sort of structured policy language, to say, to sort of universalize that they all should have done X given this intent, right? Like there's a certain, you're sort of creating this distributed runtime that only works if you can sort of, haha, I knew I would trigger him into raising his hand. Nicola, what did I get wrong?
No, no, no. To be honest, I promised to myself to don't interrupt and understand because it is a different vision. I wanted to understand. I mean, what is the different idea? I mean, but I mean, what still I struggle to understand is this. Okay, so now we are focusing on identity. Thinking about AI agent likewise if they are I mean something different, but I still believe AI agents are workloads. I mean, and do believe industry likewise with microservices at some point we'll understand that if we want to scale AI agents we will need also messaging stream processing likewise we did with microservices. Okay, so when we get in the field of asynchronous messaging and we stop using HTTP, everything's changed. Also, maybe we don't know which component is going to read the message and act. So, for instance, in microservices, one of the pattern that has been used is the saga pattern. So in the saga pattern, there is the next workload that is going to pick a message and is going to do something. So it's not guaranteed it's going to be just one, can be n of them. And maybe those components don't even exist when the saga started. So what does it mean? If I want to delegate to a workload that does not exist, I don't know what is the identity, okay? So if I'm trying to tie the security to the identity, those use cases, they cannot work. So they looks like to me, they're just some sort of workaround to try to stick to the auth model because everything started from there because the MCP adopted auth and then they realized that auth was not working. But that's just the first step. They will understand that with asynchronous flow, there are bigger challenges. And the good part of AI agents will be proper the asynchronous workflow. So, I don't know. I mean, this is a different opinion from what I have. But in my, what I think is that we should start looking at system in a different way. And the only way to solve this is to start looking at execution. And the execution somehow has to be embedded also in the security model. Because if the execution is not embedded in the security model, you will always have all those problems that you are trying to solve with identity, gateway, and so on. Okay? So, I mean, I'm still not convinced of the idea of using identity for AI agents. I mean, identity
And
they are good, maybe to create an intent, but I'm not sure they are good for delegation. I mean, that's my opinion.
so in our current thinking, agent identity is almost like nice to have because the intent is what counts. In the world where agents are very ephemeral, it is indeed almost impractical to keep track of the agent identity itself. While the intent may be something with a long-lasting characteristic.
Yeah, but I mean, how would you tie it to the next executor? Because I mean, if you simplify the flow, it is a workload n, which is going to call a workload n plus one. This is going to happen after a workload n minus one asks to do something. That's the easiest model. So if you simplify to this, it can be just a messaging flow. So, for
Yep.
instance, when I start looking at this problem, I started, as my background was on distributed system, not security, I start to ask everyone, say, okay, but as you work on security, how are you currently using your auth in distributed system? I mean, so far I didn't get still an answer. So my question is, as we are building distributed systems since decades, and nobody have been managed to use them with auth properly, probably there is something that is fundamentally wrong. That's why, since the beginning, I don't fully agree on following MCP in their idea, because they are focused on off. But off is not going to work in this use case. I mean, I was saying this 2 years ago, then everyone they were saying they were not thinking about this. And then arrived the AI agents and they said, okay, we have this problem. But those are distributed system problem. They are not AI agent problem. So also the if you get all the zero trust networks access, it's the same. They have the same problems. So then there is another problem. If you want something that has to be really distributed, has to go through the boundaries. So there should be no perimeter. There should be a way to get this execution to go through the boundary in a secure way. So it's the more I'm looking at the problem, because also myself I'm studying, I mean, the more I understand that this is an execution problem. So we need to proper to change model and identify, they're not going to solve the problem. Then we got did that are good to represent identifier, but they are slow for the internal computing. So if an enterprise has to manage each workload with a did, it's not possible, it's too slow. Okay, and in that regard, SPIF is much better. So for sure, I think at some point also the industry is gonna start bridging SPIF with DIT, because you're gonna use DIT for the public internet and SPIF for the internal network. But still, you need to understand where you need identities. I do feel we need them, because, for instance, if an AI agent wants to start something, let's suppose I have an AI agent that is in charge to monitor the network based on some events, is going to decide to do something. So in that use case, the intent is going to be expressed by the AI agent. Okay? So this means I need to provide some permission to that identity, which is a workload identity. In that case, I do need an identity. But to propagate the execution, I'm not sure I need it. So, I mean, but this is just
Yeah.
my. I'm not saying that
Wouldn't
I'm
there be
right. I have a different vision.
wouldn't there be a difference between agents with a ephemeral character that are just temporary workloads versus agents that have a true entity that have a long life that actually are with us for like weeks, months, years? Shouldn't we make a distinction between both?
But so you will need identifier, because then you have another problem. There is also the problem of scaling. So let's suppose I want to scale an AI agent. Of course, let's suppose I have, let's take the first example. I have the security team agent. So this AI agent is able to monitor the network and express an intent. Okay. Then, of course, I don't want just one of them. I want to scale. This means that I'm going to have 1,000 copy of this AI agent. So each of them should have a different identifier. So each of them should be a different identifier for auditing, but the intent should be expressed by each of them based on their original identity. So theoretically, this identity should be shared across all these replicas.
So is it the identity shared, or is it the context that will be shared with these 1,000 instances of the same agent? And so do we need a content identifier, context identifier, rather than an agent identifier?
Yeah, but what I mean by identity, that maybe is not properly correct terms in this case, is that I need to associate permission. Based on this permission, I should be able to express my intent. Okay, so each copy has to refer to the same permission. So how do you assign permission to an entity? Usually you have an identity and you assign permission to the identity. So you would have lots of replica, and each of them would have their identity to express, they would share the same identity if they are the clone, to express intent. But this is just to start a flow. But if a human decided to do something, I don't need an identity at all. I don't need, I need just to propagate the execution. That's it. I need maybe just an identifier for auditing, but I don't need it in the security model itself. So that's why I still don't understand why the industry is trying to go in this direction. And something that is interesting, I mean, if we look, for instance, at service mesh, they started to capture something different, which is the execution. So service mesh, they are showing that there is a use case because they say, okay, I want to transition from node 1 to node 2, and I need to transition it between two identifier, okay? So service mesh is showing there is a need. It's already existing before than AI agents. But currently what they are doing is just to validate the OAuth token. That's it, the GWT token. But it's incomplete because the execution itself is not in the security model. So if the execution is outside the security model, there will be always vulnerability. That's the, I mean, I have a completely different idea on this. Maybe Alan knows more about it, can express his opinion as well.
I gave you a thumbs up. I think agents need identifiers, not identities.
Yeah, I mean, identity just if you want, if it's autonomous. If let's suppose there is an IoT object, and this is deployed in the field and has to start the transaction, the flow. I mean, in that case, you don't have a human identity. You have a machine. So who started this flow? That's my question. The only use case where I see an identity to a machine is this, when there is no human and the machine, also with some mechanics, is able to start an action. That's the use case where I see an identity for the machine. Apart that, in the security model, I don't need them. So speaking in terms of security model, I agree that we don't need an identity. We need just to express the intent. That's it.
I see that Matthew also raised his hand.
So I think you might just want to start actually removing the agent and like model it from a like law firm. This concept of actually focusing on intent as the identifier sort of makes sense. So I could, tell my secretary, which I don't have, but if I tell my secretary, she calls the secretary of the other law firm, and then they schedule with the lawyer to contact me. You've got sort of you've got a transaction or an intent that's kind of being moved for these systems, and then it comes back. And for me, where it's going to get difficult for identity is like I could tell the receptionist, hey, have the lawyer transfer money from this account to the other account, but the receptionist shouldn't have that power. But it can get really weird where the lawyer might call up my receptionist and say, I need this from you. And then she now has been told to do something which is a very smaller permission, but is connected to a larger permission. And it starts to get, it starts to eat its own tail. It starts to Ouroboros very quickly.
Amazing.
Any other questions? Any other questions or comments?
Oh, I have one, just a quick one. Is how ongoing is this work? If anyone listening to this happened to already be an ICU member, how would they get involved? Just contextualize a little bit where this goes from here. What's the future?
Yep. So there is a paper that we are working on with a number of people within Thales and outside of Thales. We've got a team that is doing standardizations, and that is one of their works. And so we want to bring this to ITU for now, but open to suggestions. We on this particular topic, we also work with Google, with the Office of the CTO, to build a proof of concept and to basically experiment with technology before that we actually want to push this into open standardizations or what have you. So I would say help us. I don't know. We've got ideas, but not always very sure on how the path is moving forward with that.
That sounds brilliant. Ward, would you mind just shifting so because I don't know about if you just move your head a little bit so I can scan the
sorry.
code.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned that the DSL aspect of how you're going to model permissions, whether in verifiable presentations or in JWTs, you mentioned that you saw a sort of orthogonal piece there in designing the permissioning system that would be appropriate for these use cases. And I would say that is not exactly a work item of this working group, but something that we're dancing around and see the eventual need to do and might end up doing ourselves as a group, or at least being really interested if any of us goes off and does it somewhere else. So I'd be very eager for us to stay in touch. I think I speak for the whole group when I say we're also very interested in that design work about what permission or capability expression. I always call it a DSL, but that's probably not the right term for it. I was an English major. So that design process is one thing that occurs to me as something we should keep in touch about group to group.
And definitely love to. So we are still looking around on how actually to bring this forward. Personally, I'm a very big believer that we need a lot of standardization initiatives, and that we need to converge at a given point in time, because the problem is too big to be addressed by one single vendor, even by Google or Microsoft or whatever. So we need to find ways to collaborate across industry. So this may be like the starting point of more to come. Definitely very much open to it.
Amazing. Well, I think we should probably wrap up there, but this has been fantastic. Thank you to Ward and to everyone for your questions, which have been amazing. And what a very thought-provoking thing. I feel that we've only just scratched the surface of this topic, and obviously lots of people have been thinking about it in different ways. So it feels like a really fruitful thing to carry on. So Ward, thanks again. And to reiterate what Juan just said, please do stay in touch, and we'd love to kind of collaborate however we can best.
Super. Thanks for the opportunity. My pleasure.
Brilliant.
Good.
Thank you very much.
Have a good evening, good day. Bye now.
Good evening, everyone. Bye.
Bye.